The problem I have, as you know, is I'm a very clear-eyed critic of the gaslighting undertaken in this country by right-wing media. That the idea is probably best proved by the fact that so many of you think the BBC is left-wing. That is what neutrality and impartiality looks like. And of course, if all the other media you receive is possessed of pungent opinions, and the massive majority of the pungent opinions permitted in the public space by media owned by a tiny number of billionaires is right-wing, then the BBC ends up looking left-wing. It's why people have such a problem with me, I think, because I do lean towards what you might call more Christian or fairer politics, and it's so rare. You're supposed to say you're a Christian and then vote to not give children free school meals. So what you're supposed to do in the crucible of British politics and media, you're supposed to announce that you're a Christian and then vote for profoundly un-Christian things. You know, people cautiously suggesting that actually, you know, we should look after society's most vulnerable, not talk about personal responsibility when they perish. There aren't many of us around, as I keep reminding you, and that's how you can end up thinking that the BBC must be left-wing, because everything else you see and hear, the statues are quite a good example, must be right-wing. But so I worry when I start to say to you that I have a sense that Keir Starmer is... Well, if it was a half-term report, I think it would be must try harder. But if you were the teacher charged with telling him where he must try harder, I wonder how much space you could fill. So what I'm saying is, am I drawing my own conclusions? Am I drawing my own ideas from a pool that has already been polluted by ludicrous tribalism, the appalling, slave, sycophantic support of Boris Johnson's government, even as it presides over one of the highest death rates in the world and one of the worst economic performances on the planet. So, and then, of course, you flip it the other way around and you start thinking, well, if the opposition, if the government are presiding over that, and that's not an opinion, that's just counting, where is the leader of the opposition? So I guess I'm suggesting that even I may occasionally suffer from looking at the story through a distorted lens, and the distortion of the lens is, of course, the ludicrous bias of the British media. I don't know is the short answer, but I can only speak as I find, and I am beginning to find Keir Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party unimpressive, borderline unsatisfactory. Not everyone on the front bench gets tarred with the same brush, but I can't quite understand why he is not landing more sincere objections to things that have been done to us as a nation. You know, how many of us have lost people who shouldn't have been lost? How many of us have being completely abandoned by Rishi Sunak's furloughing scheme? How many of us are going to suffer in the future avoidably because of slow responses? He took this is Sunak, not Johnson, but it's the leader of the opposition's job to take them both on. That 5 hours, 5 hours before it expired, the decision to extend the furlough saw a record rise in redundancies. All of these things are true, and all of these things have been said by the leader of the opposition. And of course, he's battling against the forelock-tugging tendency, or the post-Brexit suspension of reality, where you still cling to the notion that having more having voted for less red tape, ending up with more red tape is a glorious victory. I don't know how you unpick that, but I'd at least like to see him try. You know, you voted you believed the fellow when he said there'd be no border in the Irish Sea. You believed the fellow when he said there'd be less red tape. You believed the fellow when you said the economy would improve. You believed the fellas when they said that your freedom of movement wouldn't be affected at all. All of these things are just true. But you're not yet ready to admit that the polar opposite coming true is somehow proof that you were right to vote for less red tape when you ended up with more. And I don't know why the leader of the opposition isn't proving more effective on that. Today's speech is supposed to address... is we're told, reported, it will address the thing we touched on yesterday, actually, about the post-war settlement. So one of the great problems with approaching British history with almost both eyes shut, actually, and a finger in one ear, is that it ignores facts. So the fact that Churchill lost in 45, the fact that he never actually won an overall majority, detracts in no way whatsoever from his wartime leadership. But he lost in 45, and the reason why he lost is because the country didn't feel that he was the man to lead the peace. And Starmer today, as I understand it, will seek to cast himself as the man to lead a post-COVID country. After the war against COVID hopefully is over, he wants to talk about a kind of new deal, if you like. I don't know if people are going to mention FDR, at least the most obvious comparison, but I told you yesterday we had about 10 years between 45 and 55 where the sacrifice of the Second and to a lesser extent the First World War was so acute and so keenly felt and so clear to see in front of us, coupled with a burgeoning media, which meant that you would find out about things that had happened in Germany within hours, as opposed to going back to I don't know, choose the Boer War. It'd take you weeks to find out what had happened over there. So newspapers and media and radio and television in its infancy created a completely different environment in which it was felt in 45 we cannot get away with the ideological persecution of the poor. It's just not going to work anymore. And then by 55 roughly it was normal business. And now in 2020 you've got people in the House of Commons who write books about how wonderful the Victorians were. So Starmer's got a big hill to climb. We'll take the speech live. We'll be joined by Theo Usherwood after the news. And you may completely disagree with me that I feel this is a really important speech for Starmer, because there is something almost surreal about a government in a civilised country presiding over record-breaking death rates, world-beating death rates, incomparable economic failure, and still being ahead in the polls. Now, I don't know who you can blame that on except the fella that should be ahead in the polls. Here's my problem. I'm doing the, what's it called, cognitive dissonance again. I completely agree that the absence of charisma is a problem. But simultaneously, I also believe that the absence of charisma shouldn't be a problem. Especially when you look at charismatic politicians throughout history. And I'll pick a few, like Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. You know, oh, I wish he was more like them. No one's thinking that. So what are they thinking? I wish he'd say exactly the same words he said, but with a little bit more Tony Blair. Tony Blair wasn't really a kid. Well, he could. if you see Tony Blair watching Robin Cooks... I'm not advocate
for Tony Blair, but he did have charisma.
He's had a sprinkling, didn't he, of something. Just call it stardust, call it whatever you will. I don't know. Phone lines are open. Give me a ring. Say whatever you like. It's my own cognitive dissonance. I completely agree. And some of you don't. Some of you claiming that... We'll call it charisma, for want of a better word. Doesn't matter. I only care about substance, not style. I don't agree. John says, not so much a lack of charisma as the unfamiliar sound of a grown-up talking. There's a reason why a speech lands differently from a written article. There's a reason why a speech lands differently from a newspaper article. And that reason, very simply, is personality. But it feels it's such a sort of blunt instrument, isn't it, to accuse someone of lacking it? And yet I'm afraid it matters. Politics is, possibly always has been. Harold Wilson, he quoted. There's a famous story about Harold Wilson. Like most famous stories I share on the radio, it'll probably turn out not to be true, but nonetheless it still possesses a certain charm. In that he'd be doing, this is when all TV was live. Theo, stay awake.
Yeah.
You might like this. So all TV was live, and so he'd be doing a speech to a room full of people at, say, the Working Men's Club or something like that, but he was due to cross to the national news at a certain time, and they'd do a countdown, and he'd break off from the speech he was doing, stick his pipe in his mouth, and do straight down the barrel a completely separate miniature segment that was designed entirely for the television news bulletin. And then once the cameras had gone off again, he'd go back to the speech that he was doing. I've no idea whether it's true or not, but it speaks to a truth. And the truth is that presentation matters, style matters. It shouldn't be allowed to supersede substance, and I worry that we're living in an era where it has completely trumped substance. Deliberate pun. But we are where we are. Couple of calls, and then mystery out. It's quite funny, Theo, because my switchboard's a bit jumbled up, so I'm looking through the brief notes on what people are poised to say about Keir Starmer, and then smack in the middle of it, we've got, why is cricket more popular in Yorkshire than anywhere else in England?
Don't know that one.
No, nor do I. We may get onto it later. Ian's in Feltham. Ian, what's going on?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
Well, I listened to the speech. I really tried to keep myself listening to it because it was so dull. But the points he made...
Dull in delivery?
Well, yes, but that could have been a speech made by Jeremy Corbyn with sincerity. There's no sincerity in it.
Right.
It was just he thought what people wants to hear.
Right.
There's no sincerity at all.
Okay.
And I'm a lifelong socialist, and I wouldn't vote for him.
No. Well, there's a surprise, Ian.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I bet he had a really open mind before he started speaking.
Well, all he's done is attack
Sarcasm
members
emoji.
of the Labour Party.
Yeah, all right, mate.
Former
Have a great day.
Corbynites.
Yeah, let's keep on fighting among each other, Ian, because that will really stick it to the Tories. Am I right or am I right, brother?
That's what he's been doing.
Come on, comrade, let's keep fighting. Let's go after him, because that will really teach Boris Johnson a lesson. Come on, comrade Ian, tell me again how awful Keir Starmer is.
Well, he could have pulled up the government on points without being opportunistic.
Right, an example of that?
Well, example is with the terrible treatment of businesses who were stiffed by insurers over business insurance.
And how can he, with 4 years until he gets into government, use that as a political leverage?
He could have publicised it.
Right.
He could be.
How do you know about it?
Transport workers.
How do you know about it?
How do I know about
Yeah.
it? Because I've been following the story in the financial press.
So it's been publicised.
He hasn't stood up and championed the small guy
Right.
against the big guy.
Well, we listen to
socialism.
completely.
Yay,
Yay, down with Labour, says our pocket socialist Ian, mate. Good luck. Shall we do a quick rousing chorus of the red flag before you jog on?
Yes. Why not?
Lavinia Grace is in Bermondsey. Lavinia Grace, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I'm already in a mystery hour mood, so I apologise for any levity and immaturity that infects this political conversation.
Okay, well, what I would like to say about him,
Yes.
because I've just heard him
Yes.
on the radio, and all I'm going to say is one word. It actually sums it up in one.
Go on.
Right? He's...
Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
No, hold on a minute.
Oh, all right.
He's too much in his comfort zone.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why that is.
Yeah.
To me, it's not about being like Tony Blair, talk the talk and walk the walk. Whatever he said on the radio, it wasn't coming from his heart.
Why do you want to say that's the second caller to say that it's not coming from its heart? How do
Can I
you
just
know?
say this, please?
Yes, of course you can.
Well, what I'd like to say as well, because I care about our country and I care about the people,
Yes.
okay? And if I was up there and if I was talking and if I was challenging the Conservative Party, right, I wouldn't be thinking about me, myself and I. I'd be up there thinking about our country and our people.
Right, and you felt he talked exclusively about himself. I'm going to have to check the tapes on this. Lewis is in Exeter. Lewis, what would you like to say?
I wasn't going to call up until that socialist fella was, rambling on. I texted my buddy and said that, these socialists are going to be moaning because he's actually talking about a deliverable vision for the future, which can actually happen and deliver,
Yes.
social justice and tackle, the climate emergency, because this isn't going anywhere. And how many times do Labour have to lose until, these nut jobs and, these fringe people of the Labour Party realise that?
Well, I mean, you say nut jobs. They've had 5 years in the driving seat, and so you can understand why it's very, very difficult to let go of the wheel, even though they drove into a brick wall.
Well, that's what, I'm, former Labour member myself and whatnot, and I said, well, what Keir Starmer, I haven't really been a fan of him, for being honest, but this speech, I thought...
Do you like that, did you?
Sensible.
Yeah, that swung you back, did it? A bit?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think, when Sadiq's talking about the culture war, the Tories launch this culture war because they don't have any policy.
Well, why would you want to talk about statues if you were doing well on actual things that matter?
Well, that's it. And Starmer just pointed it out. So it will just, nullify this, endless culture war of statues and say, well, children are, starving and, life expectancy is stalling and this will, actually allow us
why
to move
doesn't
forward.
that land? Is it a sort of psychological self-protection in the sense that if you convince yourself that it can't happen to you, you have to convince yourself that the people who it can happen to somehow deserve it? I know that's really simplistic, but when people ignore big numbers, that idea that, the old, really predictably, that old poem about first they came for, and it's designed to make you realise that what's done to Theo today could be done to me tomorrow. And yet it's a human truth, isn't it? It's an eternal truth of human interactions that we never believe the bad stuff will happen to us, or we put epic effort into believing that the bad stuff will never happen to us.
Yeah, it's always someone else, and I think that it's been...
And it's always their fault once it's been put through the mangle of usually right-wing media and politics.
Yeah, I think, I'm obviously not a Tory, but I think this, particular flavour of conservatism is really extreme, and we've had it for 10 years. It'll take some time to turn that ship around, and I think if Starmer actually delivers on this, I mean, it's a, there's a number of years to go.
You're not a conservative, Lewis, you say, but what you just described the modern Conservative Party as is very much of a piece with what Philip Hammond described it as in 2019. So it's perfectly possible to hold that view and also be a small C Conservative.
I was just going to say, the switch, I think, Cameron and Ed Miliband had a very different relationship between on the facts and the arguments than Boris Johnson has with Keir Starmer. So I think the switch actually hasn't been for the past 10 years. So if you think back to the 2015 general election, Miliband versus Cameron, and they were arguing over education policy, funding for the NHS, whether it's private or not.
I think you're both right. But you certainly wouldn't have Cameron standing up in public stating something that was at the time demonstrably untrue and then became untrue in the context, for example, of the border in the Irish Sea, and then just waltzing off into the next chapter completely unchallenged. And I don't think the Labour Party, Keir Starmer and many of his colleagues have worked out how the hell you deal with that yet. And that is a little bit Trumpish, I'm afraid.